And here we go, everything you ever wanted to know about school counseling and other duties as assigned. Here's what we're going to cover over in the next 3 weeks. You're going to understand some things that go into school counseling contracts so that you'll understand when you get to the school what is expected of you. I'll talk a little bit about other duties school counselors frequently perform. I'll talk about school counselors' roles in PBIS, RTI, 504, and IEP special education. I'm going to talk about some other ancillary duties that you may be tasked with as a school counselor. And then, very importantly, I'm going to talk about how to professionally and effectively advocate for your role as a school counselor. This week, we're going to talk about contracts and PBIS RTI. I recently pulled this school counseling contract, and it's not really a contract, I shouldn't call it that, I suppose. It's more of a job posting or a job description from a middle school. There's a lot of words on this screen, so clearly I don't want you to be too overwhelmed, but I do want to highlight a couple of really key important ideas. Look under performance expectations. There it states that the school counselor will counsel with students individually and in small groups for specifically identified needs, including personal, academic, and vocational growth. That pretty much sounds exactly like what we've been talking about so far, right? We also consult with parents, school staff, and other pupil personnel specialists and community agency personnel to help students experiencing problems. A school counselor will meet with students to provide information on curricular and extracurricular alternatives and the career goals to which they may lead. The school counselor will assist students in making appropriate educational and vocational choices and assist parents and students in the preparation and processing of college, scholarship, and employment applications. So keep looking through here. Now is where it starts to get a little bit different from what you've already known as the role of school counselor. Providing orientation for new students. Well, that seems like an appropriate role that a school counselor would play, even though it's somewhat outside of the ordinary. How about this? Assisting in identification, referral, and appropriate placement of students with special needs. Now, in everything you've been reading so far in your textbook and learning so far from the Missouri Comprehensive School Counseling Program Manual, does this sound like something that school counselors usually perform in a school? Does it sound like the role of a school counselor? What about this? Providing appropriate feedback to teachers regarding the needs of students. Absolutely, that sounds like an appropriate task. What about providing counseling for departing students, transfers, and dropouts? That seems like it would also be an appropriate task. Now, assisting with the coordination and interpretation of standardized testing. Standardized testing. Does that sound like something that a school counselor is generally going to perform in a school? Probably not. Now, here's some kind of logistical information. Participating in curriculum development, okay. Serving on faculty meetings, great. Attending staff meetings and department-sponsored workshops. These all sound very spot on. But take a look here. Performs other related tasks as required. What might that entail? If you've been in a school long enough, you probably know that a school counselor is tasked with many, many different things, and often it's because they're in such a unique position in the school, and people don't often understand their role within the school. Think about it. A school counselor is neither teacher nor administrator. They have an advanced degree and very specialized knowledge, but there's usually only 1, 2, 3, or even 4 of them in a building. So how do schools effectively utilize these school counselors to promote the needs of the students and support their students? This is a really important question to ask because, quite frankly, when I see school counselors who are doing a lot of duties outside of the role of school counseling, what I most often see is that these folks are doing so because they don't have a clear understanding of the role themselves. It's important that you all really dive into your studies and recognize how a school counselor should operate in the schools. Now, when you get into the schools, it may not be ideal. Look at this job right here. I bet all of you would jump at a chance to have a school counseling job, even if there's some caveats in the job posting that may have you questioning what kinds of things they expect you to do. If you get into a position like this, and I hope that you will, you can spend time advocating for your profession and your position and program. You can take on certain roles. You can educate your administrators about certain things that you do. And hopefully, over the course of time, you can show how you've added enough value to the school environment that some of these extra duties start peeling away. So these other duties that we noticed at the bottom of the last slide, what are they? Well, frequently, school counselors are tasked with leading or organizing positive behavior intervention support, response to intervention, 504 plans. Oftentimes, school counselors are asked to be special education coordinators or representatives for the school or the district if the district is small, or IEP team coordinators or leaders. They're standardized test coordinators or administrators. They're responsible for attendance and truancy hearings, award ceremonies, Red Ribbon Week, and a host of other stuff that the school just needs done. You know, a school has limited resources and capacities, and sometimes they just need warm bodies to fill a position. So if you are adequately doing your job and showing the entire school body how you and your profession is valuable and benefits students, some of the stuff that needs to get done, you'll still have to take on, but much of it can be passed on to somebody else who may not have quite as many responsibilities on their plate. Here's what you should know about other duties in general. Like I mentioned, school counselors are part of the educational team at the school. Because of this, school counselors should be team players and take on a fair share of school responsibilities. However, they must be very protective of their time spent conducting the tasks that are outlined in the Missouri Comprehensive School Counseling Program. Y'all, other duties are not always bad. Sometimes they're overwhelming. Sometimes it feels daunting to take these on because they do sometimes detract from the work that you do in your program. However, they're not always bad and sometimes can even benefit the school counseling program. So what do? Well, when asked to take on duties outside the scope of typical counseling activities, the counselor should ask themselves, how can I use this particular duty to promote the mission and goals of the Comprehensive School Counseling Program? Let me give you an example. Lunch duty. If you're asked to perform lunch duty, this may feel like a huge burden. After all, lunch is an hour and a half a day frequently, and if you're just spending time monitoring student behavior in the lunchroom, then my goodness, that takes away a lot of the time that you might need to interact with your students, to perform individual small group counseling, and even classroom guidance. So what should you do? Well, think about how you can use lunch duty to your benefit. Use this time to check in with your students. Use this time to get to know your students. You know, a lunchroom is a place where a lot of conversation happens, and it's a place where you can really understand the intricate relationships between students and see their very unique personalities shine through. Take this time to get to know your students and get to know some of their personalities and how they are really doing socially within the school setting. For the next couple of minutes, I want to talk to you about two particular duties, PBIS and RTI, and how a counselor can and should fit into these particular tasks. So PBIS, or sometimes called SWPBIS, what is it? It's Positive Behavior Intervention Support, or what we frequently hear in the state of Missouri is school-wide positive behavior support. PBIS is a whole school approach, and the idea is to create a safe school climate and effectively and positively discipline students. Now, frequently when I say discipline, people think back to kind of more punitive measures, but remember, discipline means teaching, shaping behavior. So under PBIS, the idea is to manage student behavior, manage the school environment and climate so that students feel safe and can thrive when they are trying to learn within those four walls of the school. PBIS programming involves a tiered approach, and you see the tier on the screen here. The bottom level of the tier is Tier 1, and it encompasses the majority of students. The middle of the tier, the yellow part, is Tier 2, and that's a smaller portion of students who need those kinds of more intensive supports. And then the top tier is the most intensive support, and few students need interventions that would qualify under that Tier 3 support. So ultimately, the program's designed for educators to teach appropriate behavior, to promote positive choices, to reinforce positive behavior choices, and then also to intervene effectively when students make inappropriate choices. What I've taken here is from it says RTI Network, and that's a misprint. I apologize. I will go ahead and fix that later and include the correct link in your presentation materials. But this is from the Missouri school-wide PBS programming. So on Tier 1 is a universal and proactive school-wide management, and it's designed to meet the needs of all students in the school setting. So it's just kind of establishing common expectations and boundaries for students. All teachers, all employees within the building have the same understanding of how students are expected to function. This way, students in Mr. Jones's class aren't allowed to run around the school building at all hours of the day, while students in Miss Smith's class are expected to sit quietly and never make a peep. So of course there's autonomy, and each teacher has the ability to kind of structure their own classroom, but ultimately this sets the tone for the entire feel of the school. Oftentimes you'll see things like, one that comes to mind is the Wildcats. There was a school that I worked with called the Wildcats, and the Wildcats had Wildcat Wow every Friday, and students who were succeeding in class and who teachers had identified as doing a really great job were either dismissed a few minutes early from school or had the opportunity to have additional computer time. So just an opportunity for students, even at the high school level, to have a little bit extra incentive to maintain positive behavior in the school setting. So under Tier 2, this is a more targeted intervention, and the way that we identify students under Tier 2 is through data. So who are the students who are constantly being referred for disciplinary issues? We identify those students, and then we put in place pretty strategic interventions to help these students change their negative social, emotional, and or behavioral patterns. So this might be small group interventions. It might be, a couple of weeks ago, I talked to you all about the GENTS program, the gardening program for young men. Remember that was a program that was started because there were some students at risk of negative behaviors, and that would be considered a Tier 2 intervention. So it's a group-wide intervention, and it's creative. It's not necessarily a punitive measure. It's really something more positive to incentivize students to behave in a more appropriate way in school. And finally, in Tier 3, Tier 3 provides just very intensive support for those few students who continue to experience difficulty and are not succeeding under the Tier 1 and 2 interventions. So sometimes this can be special education referrals. Sometimes it can be specialized counseling. Sometimes it can be interventions that are really individualized. Think about an elementary school classroom, for example, and how you might have one student who is on a functional behavior plan or a behavior intervention plan, excuse me. So those are students who would receive Tier 3 supports. Well, there you go. Look at the bottom of this slide. That should be on the last one. So RTI, what is RTI? Response to intervention is a tiered approach. Sounds familiar, right? Used for early identification and support for students with learning and behavior needs. Now, look at this graphic with the tier. It is the exact same for RTI as it is for PBIS. There are 3 tiers. The bottom tier is universal. The middle tier, Tier 2, is a little more in-depth and intensive interventions. And Tier 3 is for students who have the most extreme needs. So the sense that I can make out of this for you is that RTI is kind of a more traditional approach. It's not old by any stretch of the imagination. RTI really came out in the early 2000s, really, and RTI was this approach to identifying students for special education. Prior to RTI being widely implemented and understood, students were identified for special education in the following way. A teacher or a parent would have a concern about a student. They would approach someone that was the designee at the school, usually the school counselor, and they would say, I want to refer my student for special education. When this happened, there was an immediate timeline that began, and the clock started ticking for the amount of time that could pass from when a student was originally identified until when the student's testing and evaluation was complete and a placement decision was made. So frequently it was about 60 days. Now, you guys know that I was a counselor in the early 2000s, and so what happened frequently in the early 2000s is that I would get a teacher coming up to me and they would say, I need a packet for this student. And that was a universal code, if you will, for this student is not performing well in class and I'm going to refer them for special education. So what my job was then to do is to observe the student, find another individual in the school to go observe the student and kind of develop a functional behavior assessment or an assessment of their abilities to work well in class during instructional time. I would then do a couple of different tests with the student. I'd do the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement, and then a school psychologist or psychological examiner would come in and they would do the IQ test, which was usually the Woodcock-Johnson IQ test or the WISC IQ test. And the idea was that a student's ability as measured on the Woodcock-Johnson's achievement test should be equivalent to their aptitude as measured by the IQ test. So you have these 2 different tests, and we're essentially saying a student who's functioning at their ability and aptitude level should have identical scores on each of these 2 tests. There's some complicated statistics that go into this, and I would definitely get into it at another point, but suffice to say, common sense would tell you if you have 2 different tests and they ask different questions and expect different things, they're not going to be equal, even under the best of circumstances. There's some error in there. However, what was happening is that we were using these tests and this something called a discrepancy model to identify students for special ed. So a student needed to score 15 points below their aptitude in order to qualify for special education. Now, the point system differs state to state. It's actually a state mandate. but it's usually 1 standard deviation or 1.5 standard deviations below their IQ test. In other words, their achievement test score had to be 1 standard deviation below their IQ test score. If you take an average IQ of 100 and you give someone with a 100 IQ the Woodcock-Johnson achievement test and they score an 84 on the achievement test, that is 1 standard deviation below average. And that student would qualify because of that 15-point discrepancy. They would qualify for special ed. Unfortunately, what happened here is that the students who were just not performing well in school, they wouldn't qualify for special education if they didn't meet that discrepancy. And they would be sent back to the regular education classroom and they would fall behind and often fail. There was nothing in place to support these students' learning needs. So some really, I think, pretty innovative folks from Iowa came up with this idea of response to intervention, which was this approach to putting in place specific interventions to help a student regardless of their IQ or ability. If a student was failing, we would put in place structured interventions to support them. We would assess the student's response to those interventions. And if they were successful, we would pare back on some of those more intensive interventions. If they were not successful, we would push forward and do even more intensive interventions. So no student was being left behind. If you work in a school environment currently, you know that this is just the way schools now operate. Schools kind of just do this intuitively now. We have this thing called differentiated instruction, and because differentiated instruction exists, we have the ability to kind of adapt our instruction and our delivery to meet the needs of diverse students with diverse learning needs. However, back then, that wasn't the case. Back then, students really either qualified for special ed or they didn't. And if they qualified for special ed, they would get the supports that they needed and have an IEP. But if they didn't, they would often be left behind and just struggle for the rest of their schooling. I've seen a bit of a pendulum shift back away from RTI and back to the more traditional model of identifying students for special education based on whether or not they were meeting that discrepancy. So I'm not sure what the future holds. I certainly hope that schools just use common sense and help their students be successful. However, I do understand that special education programming is very expensive and we must put in place some kind of systematic approach to help identify students who are really in need of more extensive services. So all that to say, RTI still around, maybe not quite as much as before, and RTI used to deal with behavior and academic needs. It still does a little bit, maybe not quite as much the behavior needs, but academic needs for sure are being kind of identified through an RTI type approach. Most schools nowadays would not assess a student or evaluate a student for special education unless the teacher provides evidence that they have put in place several interventions and have monitored those interventions with appropriate data, and that the student has not been successful with those interventions. If the teacher cannot provide evidence of that, most schools will not assess that student for special education and instead will insist that that student receive the interventions necessary to be successful. By now, hopefully you've had a chance to read through Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 and understand a little bit about how they operate. So how are school counselors involved in RTI and PBIS? This is a graphic that comes straight from the Missouri Comprehensive School Counseling Program, and it's their tiered approach. It mirrors the approach to RTI and PBIS that we just discussed. So in Tier 1, the proactive interventions target 100% of the students, and Missouri Comprehensive School Counseling Program, our program, says that school counselors have a place in doing these proactive interventions. We provide some sorts of educational activities. We provide transition activities to help students transition from grade level to grade level or even from class to class. We do appraisal for decision making. In other words, are students able to make decisions about how they should be behaving or acting in the school? And we do classroom guidance units and lessons that cover developmental standards, our grade level expectations, GLEs, if you will. So school counselors have a big place in delivering the school counseling curriculum and providing individual student planning and support to help students meet their educational needs. Under Tier 2, we have more strategic interventions that target a lesser number of students, probably 20 to 25% of students. Excuse me. Now, under Tier 2, we have activities like consultation, where the teachers meet together with the counselor and they discuss specific strategies to help the student be successful. We have short-term individual counseling. Remember, school counseling in the schools is brief, it's not therapy. But if we sense that a student is struggling either with behavior or academics, we can go ahead and implement short-term counseling, brief counseling, and we can support that student and see if just the simple act of us working with that student to kind of understand their issues and work through them could potentially benefit that student outside of just the counseling setting, and that would transcend into academic and behavioral success. And we can also do small group counseling. One thing that I did that was very academically based is I implemented a program in my school called Student Success Skills. And in Student Success Skills, it was a whole class approach. So I went into the classroom and I taught students problem-solving techniques, how to recognize achievements that they had made, how to celebrate the achievements that they had made, how to look through various texts or works that they were given and identify key areas, which, I mean, if you think about it, that's a pretty academic thing to do. But goal setting and identifying achievements and celebrating achievements is absolutely something that school counselors can have a place in. So I did this at the school level. And then for my students who were performing far below grade level, I had them be part of a small group counseling session for student success skills. And we talked about the same things we did in the class, only more individualized and to a more intensive extent, I guess. So after monitoring my students' progress from the beginning of the small group until the end, it was an 8-week period, I saw an unbelievable amount of progress in my students' math and English language arts grades. They had increased by 1 letter grade without exception. That's pretty impressive. So do I know that there was a perfect correlation, or do I know that there was causation between the work that I did in small group counseling and the students' outcomes? Absolutely not. But there was enough of a correlation that I could say that I contributed to those students' success. And that's a powerful thing to be able to tell a school administrator or teachers or other stakeholders that the work that I'm doing as a school counselor contributes to academic success. Finally, the top tier is what we often see in the responsive services, and it's what many counselors think their job is, which is to handle referrals and to do crisis intervention. So hopefully by now, over the course of the semester, you've learned that if you are spending 90% of your time with 10% of your students up there at Tier 3, you've unfortunately missed the boat. But we do have a hand in meeting all three of these tiered interventions to helping students be successful. So what should school counselors do if tasked with PBIS or RTI? Review Missouri's comprehensive school counseling program tiered approach. Align your school counseling goals with PBIS or RTI objectives. So if your school counseling goal is to promote a positive school climate where students respect and value each other, then form lessons around respect and value. That would fit under Tier 1. Do small group activities with students who have higher levels of disciplinary referrals and teach them about positive behavior choices, coping skills, stress management, etc. That would be Tier 2. And finally, meet individually, one-on-one, or refer students with the highest levels of disciplinary referrals or struggles to somebody who can assist them in making positive behavior choices or help them in a more therapeutic manner. One other thing to note, I've seen in the Tier 3, that top tier, is pairing individual students up with mentors. This is frequently seen in the check-in, check-out program that school counselors lead, where a student will be paired up with a teacher or with the counselor, and they'll go once a day, once every 2 or 3 days, once a week, etc., and check in with the counselor as a way to hold the student accountable for making positive choices. Finally, identify the school counseling program's resources. Who can be involved in this? Figure out the school counseling program's strengths. Are you, as a school counselor, very gifted at running small groups? Well, then you fit pretty well under that Tier 2 of PBIS. Determine how you can maintain the integrity of your school counseling program while supporting the PBIS or RTI program. Now, it's almost not fair of me to give you PBIS and RTI first, because much of what PBIS and RTI do is entirely related to the work of school counseling. However, in the coming weeks, I'm going to talk to you some more about what to do if you as a school counselor are given a duty that is so far-fetched that it doesn't seem to align with the goals of a school counseling program. So my personal take and what I want to leave you with right now is, what should school counselors do if tasked with PBIS or RTI? Personally, I think you should find it flattering, and I think you should take it on. However, don't let it consume everything that you do. You have work to do under the 4 components of the Missouri Comprehensive School Counseling Program that fall outside the scope of PBIS or RTI. However, PBIS and RTI fit very well within responsive services and individual student planning, and I hope that you'll have the opportunity to work with PBIS or RTI in the future.